another episode of Let's Talk AppSecOps. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Shannon Johnson, who is an expert in application security and vulnerability management. And today, we are going to talk about strategies to prioritize vulnerabilities to fix. What's the way to fix? Because there seem to be quite a few of them, not enough time and not enough resources to fix. That's what we'll focus on. But before that, I want to give a little bit of background about Shannon. So Shannon has experience ranging from public sector, Department of Defense, and in private sector, she has worked in healthcare and she has worked in B2B SaaS companies, in startups too. So she has been in companies with very small teams to very big teams, and she certainly knows the challenges of trying to resolve an unending list of vulnerabilities with a few resources that come by. So Shannon, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Yeah, Shannon. So one of the things that security teams and developers deal with and very often struggle with is how do we look at the vulnerabilities that come from whether it is applications or infrastructure and get a handle on it and maybe figure out what are the top or the highest priority vulnerabilities to tackle first. So based on your experience, I'd like to know what strategies do you use?
Yeah, so it's a really, really interesting topic because I think that it's still very much a work in progress across the industry right now. And I think the best way to illustrate the conversation is to talk as if you are just, entering into an environment where you don't know who your assets and stakeholders and risk or any of it is. You have some tooling, you have some developers working on some things, and you are just trying to figure out how you're going to build your vulnerability management program. So
Right.
your first thing ever is going to be asset discovery. You want to know where all of your assets are. So yeah.
So and that seems to be a big challenge in itself, right? Because what he's defined an asset seems to be changing. Earlier, it was quite simple. Like there was some hardware assets. You could look and say, these are the assets that I need to protect and applications running on it. So, but in this world of cloud and microservices, so how do you define an asset?
Yeah, so that has been another interesting and persistent challenge. So it used to be like the really obvious assets, right? You would have your hardware assets, which, I have my laptop. Then it was virtualized assets, right? So I have these VMs, the set of VMs. And then it was, okay, I have an SDLC now that I'm building my SaaS product with. So I have repos and the infrastructure, the clusters infrastructure. And now with the advent of cloud and it becoming more used widely across the industry, you have microservices, which are now assets, right? And so all of the microservices I wouldn't necessarily consider an asset. And so I had to kind of try to drill down on what microservices could be considered an asset in regards to a vulnerability management program. And those particular defining characteristics are that the asset has, the microservice has a definable boundary, for one. And then two, it's detectable. And then three, it's capable of exploit and remediation.
All right, excellent. Yeah, that's I think that gives a bit of structure to that. So once you are done classifying the assets or identifying the assets, so do you figure out how do you classify them? Is there some kind of a business context that you look into that, or how do you do that?
Yeah, so my experience with that is, in tandem as you're figuring out what your assets are, right? The side work there is you're also figuring out your team structure. And, we want to say, okay, well, your org chart is the structure, but that's not the case for actual remediation, right? So you want to build your vulnerability org chart, essentially. You want to define your teams, who owns what assets, right? And then you want to interview each of those teams that you're working with inside of your company and they will help you define, the subject matter experts will help you define what assets are the most critical to business functionality and what would break the business if it went down because of an exploit.
Right. All right. Okay. So then coming to the vulnerabilities now. So we looked at the assets, now coming specifically to the vulnerabilities. So how do you make sure that you have a full view of the vulnerabilities that exist in your system?
Yeah, so there's so many different dimensions to this, to answer this question here. And I spent a year aggregating a ton of different resources for that. And of course, you have your tech stack is going to have some degree of vulnerability discovery, like CrowdStrike does, Axonius does. You know, they have the 𝗪 and the 𝗙𝗵𝗂 most exploited vulnerabilities. Most of your tech stack is going to have that incorporated, right? So there's a couple of different things here. So you want to consider when you're adding to your tech stack, what paradigm of vulnerability management you want. And by that, I mean, like, there's a whole bunch of different rating systems that come up. So you can have 𝗙𝗵𝗪 that says, okay, so like libwebp, the most recent log4j lookalike, was rated a 10. And that was like a high alarm, because you never see a CVSS score of a 10, right? That's wild. So it immediately puts vulnerability managers on high alert, right? But then, you know, EPSS is a new paradigm too, which is it's more heavily based in an exploitation model, and not just, hey, there's a vulnerability and it exists within, you know, my network parameter, which there aren't really hard parameters these days, which is the whole zero trust concept, right? Built for zero trust. But if we were to kind of look at it in terms of what is exploitable and what isn't exploitable vulnerabilities, EPSS is going to be more in line with, hey, this is more than likely going to be exploited within 30 days somewhere out in the world. And so you're going to want to look at your tooling. That's one of the really good questions to ask your vendors. And Axonius is a great example. They just recently switched over to the EPSS model for all of their vulnerability ratings, right? So getting those vulnerability ratings is really important, as well as understanding from within your subject matter experts within the teams of your company, what the criticality of your assets are to the business. So those are going to be two separate things that you're going to account for.
All right. Yeah. So you're talking about, so it's not just that we have to look at the most critical assets. You're also talking about how exploitable a particular asset is. So does that mean that you might have an asset, you might have a vulnerability that is very critical, but may not have been exploited in the wild, or may not be that easily exploitable? That's one set. And the other one is maybe the problem is not that critical, but it's known to have been exploited in the wild, right? So in a situation like this, so which one would you prioritize higher?
That's a good question. So it really, and this is where the security practitioner part comes in, and this is where like assessing risk as an extension of vulnerability management really comes in, right? Because like your traditional risk equation doesn't necessarily include like your textbook definition for security exams and stuff, doesn't include like exploitability like or attack surface, or those are more ingrained inside of the other definitions. But the way that I like to think about it, and I think a really comprehensive view of risk, right, when you're talking about you know, if you have a lower CVSS or EPSS score, but my asset is super critical, and then the potential for exploit, even if the score is low, I know that that asset is doesn't have as many compensating controls within my network, then that would be even higher priority, right? So my general risk equation tends to be, how big is the attack surface? How critical is the asset to the business itself, as we talked about? And then the criticality of the vulnerability to include exploitability. So EPSS in this case for me. So EPSS plus business importance of the asset plus attack surface. And attack surface too, just super important, because if I have a ton of these machines and they are all exposed without a patch, then I have more chances for an exploit, right? So all those three work together. There are three dimensions that, like, none of them can be overlooked in the equation of, you know, how do you prioritize and stack rank asset vulnerabilities? It's not just vulnerabilities as an esoteric concept, your assets vulnerabilities. I have my assets, and then vulnerabilities assigned to those assets stack ranked.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so I see there's quite a bit that goes on from one, identifying the assets, what's an asset to begin in the first place, then looking at the vulnerabilities, and then stack ranking them, right? And in a world where the software releases or application deliveries happening at an ever increasing rate, right? The vulnerabilities that you have to deal with are quite many, and it's hard to keep up with all of them. So do you use any view together a tech stack that essentially helps you do all the things that you just mentioned? And how do you do that?
Yeah, so telemetry and orchestration tools are like the bread and butter of you know, security and security analysis and security engineering, right? So as a security engineer, you're going to build pipelines between your tools. You're going to integrate your tools together. You want them to all be speaking to each other. That's your telemetry, right? And then you want to orchestrate all of those findings in a way that makes sense for you, for the business. And like we just talked about, having a tool that I can assign the criticality of my assets manually, and that's the only manual thing I do, right? Because then it automatically pulls in the ratings of the vulnerabilities, it pulls in my asset inventory, it pulls in all of that data so that I can analyze it. And that's an orchestration tool like ArmorCode. And once I have all of that data orchestrated, that's great. You know, you get a cookie, but then what, right? I have all these teams, I have all this data. How do I communicate that? How do I parse that information out to these, like, just ton of teams, like inconceivable amounts of teams for some large enterprises? What do you do next? And the great thing about ArmorCode, in particular, as an orchestration tool, is that it digests the information, and you can do those risk assessments, which is a great feature, on your assets plus the vulnerabilities, right? And then you can actually create pipelines, which are, I think they're called runbooks in ArmorCode, right? So you create these automations where you have interviewed your stakeholders. They're saying, okay, anything that looks like this, it has these characteristics, it's a critical, but it also has, it's from this repo, it's from this highly critical asset, you know, so that it's not just bombarding them with information from your SAST and DAST tools, right? Which I actually didn't mention what goes into the orchestration tool, so I'll get back to that. But you have all that aggregated information, and they don't want every critical. Every critical doesn't matter. So you build out the pipeline, and then you can send the data via tickets to a Jira project. So your software team's project, or your DevOps project, or your infrastructure project, so that they can choose whether they want it on backlog, if they want it on to-do, or any number of things, right? So having that flow is really important. In addition, for me, when I am building out those pipelines, you want to build out pipelines to the people who directly remediate. But then you also want the dimension of large scale reporting, right? So I need to report all of the highly critical, you know, based on our risk equation, vulnerabilities to an executive stakeholder at X increment of time, like quarterly. You can aggregate all those findings within the teams as well, in addition to your individual runbooks going out to projects. And then you can give a high level overview to your security leadership or executive stakeholders or the owner, the owner of that risk, right? And so that's a really important part of vulnerability management, right? Is the accountability piece. Who makes the remediator actually accountable? And that's their leadership, right? And so you know, you work with the company, you work with your team, you work with everyone as a vulnerability management specialists, right, in security. So that kind of gives the holistic picture. So back to what goes into the orchestration tool, right? So you can connect your asset inventories tools like Axonius. You can connect your threat intel like CrowdStrike, which has sensors on all of your devices. And there's some redundancy between tools, right? And you need to engineer for those redundancies to dedupe and make sure that you're not like overwhelming your system. So there is actual engineering work that you need to do. But then you can pull from your cloud, your SAST and DAST tools, your SCA tools. And, you know, then in addition to that, there's one more dimension that's not covered in all of this, that I was actually able to build out a customized feed with a tool called Feedly, which is essentially in just a really cool web scraper, right? And the reason that I did that is because the one thing that orchestration tools don't tend to include, which this is a plug for you guys, this would be a great thing to include, is your services, right? So if Zoom has a vulnerability, I can't go and remediate that, right? But I need to know so that we can build compensating controls. So that one, we have awareness, two, executive awareness, right? So team awareness, executive awareness, and then building our moat around the castle. So finding those services. So basically you put all of the services that you guys use, the third-party vendors, into a scraper like Feedly. And then you can put additional sources, but it also has like its own way of searching in sources for just anything that drops that is a high or critical. And then you can do another parsing where any headline that drops with a higher critical and it's vulnerability related, right? And then you can have this curated feed that's not going to bombard you, but it's going to be the most critical issues regarding those third-party services. So that can actually help in your vulnerability and patch management program in addition.
All right. Wow. That was a very, very comprehensive answer right there. I think maybe you can just take a pen and a paper and put together a blueprint for a vulnerability management program, from looking at it from an AppSec engineer's perspective to workflows to the developers, and then reporting it all back to the business leaders so that they have a full view of that. And you said you developed something called Feedly. Is that something that you built on your own based on your custom needs?
Yeah. So, you know, one of my projects was, you know, gather vulnerability intel, right? And it's hard to kind of find those right now. I think it was on LinkedIn. Some of the awesome people in the community, in the security community, were asking this question, like, hey, I need to know, like, in addition to my orchestration tools, in addition to Kev, in addition to 𝗙𝗂 dropping their vulnerabilities, like, I need like the just 0-day intel, you know. And so you find that often on Reddit. You'll find it on, you know, just Twitter, even just people who've just found something, hacker communities, that kind of thing. And so searching headlines, because sometimes these drop on different security websites first, before they even hit the mainstream. That was kind of the idea. And plus, a lot of the vulnerability scoring systems are not geared towards the third-party vendors, right? Because, and it makes sense for their purposes, because they are trying to focus on things you can actually fix, right? Yeah. Whereas for your 0 days, we just need to know, right? And for third-party vendors, I can't go and fix Zoom, but I need to know as a security professional defending my company, right?
Right. Yeah, that's brilliant. You not only took care of your own applications, but made sure that if there are vulnerabilities in any tools that you use, that you are putting some compensatory controls around those. So if you were to look at life with orchestration tool or without orchestration tool, I'm like, how would you compare? Like ArmorCode, right before or after, kind of a thing. So.
Oh, it's interesting. So I have been on both sides of this. So I operated without an orchestration tool, doing you know, vulnerability management, and it is a lot of So you can't dedupe is one thing, right? So you're just like iterating on the same information from various different tools. You are spending a lot of time just with no telemetry. You are duplicating so much effort that it is, I want to say, like, just impossible to keep up with all of it, right? You're going to end up like, I'm going into CrowdStrike, I'm going to look at the most critical stuff, I'm going to create a bunch of tickets, I'm going to send them out to boards, like all that's manual, right? Oh, right. And then, I'm going to go into my cloud, my SAST and DAST and cloud scanning tools, and I'm going to take all the data from there. But CrowdStrike has some sensors in there too, so I'm just like, it is a painful process. And I would say using an orchestration tool, even though I'm an advocate for big security teams, I think security is important. I definitely think that you can reduce overhead like by a long shot with an orchestration tool. One gives you the visibility, but then so you're more effective. Your security team is more effective.
Yeah, and then focusing on the issues that matter, right? Instead of trying to basically spinning the wheels without going any place with that one. So yeah, so this has been a fantastic conversation, Shannon. Thank you so much. You went into the detail I really liked. In fact, I learned so much about how some of the intricacies of weaving together tech stack and even the people part of it and the process part of it. I'm like, it touched them all. So when we talk about challenges on a journey to AppSec maturity, we talk about that often. We talk about challenges on the people side, process side, and technology side. And you brought that all together. So appreciate you taking out time and sharing your insights with us. And looks like we might be up for another show here. Just the knowledge that you have, right? I look forward to having you in another show.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.